Welcome everybody who's joining us for the first day of Wisconsin Water Week. My name is Kevin Masarek. I'll be moderating this session today. For those of you who are joining us, you are in the groundwater stream. And in this morning's sessions, we'll all have kind of a groundwater focus on some of Wisconsin's kind of emerging or ongoing and more challenging groundwater issues. Our sponsor for this particular session is Extension Lakes. Extension Lakes is a partnership with the College of Natural Resources at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And they're also the major organizers of Wisconsin Water Week, which again is ongoing all week, a series of different themes for each day. And we hope that everybody will be able to join us for those sessions that might be of interest to them. Please feel free to take some time during the breaks to visit the exhibitors. There's a series of exhibitors that are able to provide some additional context on the professionals and staff that might be working on water issues throughout Wisconsin. This first session today is focusing on multi-partner groundwater nitrate initiatives. And our speaker is going to be John Exo. And John has been an educator and program manager with Extension since 1998. Prior to that, he wedged another extension stint between working for Sauk and Dane counties, attempting to make real improvements in people's lives and land and water quality. In his current role, John is working for the Division of Extension in CALS, College of Ag and Life Sciences, as the Water Quality Programs Coordinator, to provide science-based information to inform and provide guidance to the many stakeholders on the many complex issues around water quality. With that, John's got about a half hour to present and then hopefully leave some time for the Q&A. For the Q&A, please enter your questions into the platform, the Event Mobi platform, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can get to. And I believe John will have the opportunity to go in and maybe comment on some of the ones that we can't get to after his talk. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, John.
Thanks, Kevin. And thanks to our Zoom host, Joe Bonnell, also, and just a welcome to Chris Kucharik, a co-presenter here in the same session. I'm really honored to be here this morning on this beautiful day in Wisconsin, and really glad to be a part of this overall conference. Just behind the scenes, I have to say this has been a really great experience already, and I'll get to experience that as a Zoom host also on Thursday, talking with folks about the Drillfist area. So thank you, Kevin. So I am going to be talking a little bit this morning about why we tackle nitrate in Wisconsin, why it's a problem, where it's a problem. And the basic premise of my presentation this morning is that we would benefit from thinking about leveraging partnerships to address nitrate in ways that we do create and leverage partnerships to address other challenging issues in Wisconsin, particularly water quality issues in Wisconsin. Then I'm going to do a kind of a quick scan of some collaborative models and give some examples of collaborations that are specifically addressing nitrates in Wisconsin. So I hope to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes and then leave plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. So first, just a little bit of a primer for folks out there about where nitrate is a challenge in Wisconsin. And this is a great screenshot of a well water viewer developed at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point Center for Watershed Science, showing where elevated nitrate exists in Wisconsin. And basically what you see is that it kind of mirrors our agricultural areas in Wisconsin. The more brighter shades indicate higher levels of nitrate in Wisconsin. And these are average nitrate levels by township. So basically 36 square mile township areas in Wisconsin. And this viewer allows people to drill in more closely and look at nitrate a little bit more closely in areas that you're interested in. So I encourage folks, if they're interested, to go to that site and do that. And then, of course, you can see other parameters in addition to nitrate that folks can examine in more detail for the areas they live in. And thinking back on that previous slide, this slide is a really great tool to help understand where groundwater is more susceptible to nitrate and other contamination. Again, the brighter areas indicate areas that are more susceptible to contamination. And if you kind of think about overlaying this map with areas that are intensively farmed and have other intensive land uses, you kind of get a sense of why and where nitrate is a challenge and why it's our most common and widespread contaminant in Wisconsin. And if you look, you see kind of little ribbons of brighter orange color here. And those ribbons, many of them follow areas where the glacier carried sandy, coarse material as it melted. And we call those outwash areas. And many of those follow our major river systems, the lower Wisconsin River, the Chippewa, the Black Buffalo, etc., in the western part of the state. And then areas in central Wisconsin, what we refer to as the central sands. But really, it's important to recognize that there are a lot of areas in Wisconsin that are susceptible to groundwater contamination. And that in part is why nitrate is our most widespread contaminant in Wisconsin. So what are some of the health and environmental effects of nitrate? Many of us have heard these, and I just want to quickly review them. Most people are familiar with the fact that nitrate is a contaminant that can cause blue baby syndrome. It also increases the risk and can increase the risk of colon cancer, certain birth defects, and thyroid disease. And it is associated with aborted fetuses at high levels of nitrate with respect to livestock. In terms of sort of the basic environmental impacts, it's a driver of eutrophication, which then causes low oxygen levels or anoxia in surface water resources. It's also associated with and kind of paired with phosphorus as a cause of harmful algal blooms. And we experience those algal blooms all across Wisconsin in many of our estuaries and larger lake systems. And of course, in the Great Lakes and estuaries across the country and frankly, across the globe. And in some areas, those eutrophication is a cause of and results in what are called dead zones, where basically there's very little life in areas. The one that most people are familiar with is the Gulf of Mexico. But we have those areas in many other estuaries and both freshwater and saltwater across the globe. So here's kind of a closer to home example of that. This is a sort of a before and after comparison of a area, unique area, kind of a really unique area on the lower Wisconsin Riverway, where a number of backwater oxbow lakes or a component that addresses edge of field nitrate practices, such as saturated buffers and other practices. And those are important and helpful if adopted on a really large scale across the landscape. So I want to make a case for why partnerships, or maybe framing thinking about partnerships to address nitrate reduction in ways similar to the ways we address other water quality and other challenging societal issues. First of all, we're going to need very large increases in the adoption of nitrogen management practices. From the previous slide, you saw that some of the typical fertilizer and other nutrient management practices have rather marginal, need really large increases in adoption to make a significant difference in terms of water quality. And then when we talk about practices that are costly for either producers or for well owners and others that are specifically engaged in this issue, equity and fairness of how those decisions are made and who bears the cost of those pervades everything in those conversations. Thirdly, I really am a strong believer that thinking about and engaging in partnerships offers people an opportunity for civic engagement. There's a real need among people to be engaged in issues as locally as they are relevant to them, and working on partnerships either locally or at a larger scale offers opportunities to do that. And then really there's a lot of despair and frustration associated with this issue among people that feel like they can't have an impact, or what they're doing can have only little impact. And so engaging in partnerships with people to specifically work on these challenges can help counteract that desperation and frustration. And then partnerships offer the opportunity to maximize what existing resources we have to address this issue and similar issues. By having people and organizations complement one another, they're able to maximize resources and by doing so try and minimize duplication of activities, whether that be research or funding or outreach activities or technical service or what have you. Partnerships offer an opportunity to maximize what we do have. And then again, by bringing focus to this issue, they also offer the opportunity to expand financial and other resources to this issue. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in an example of a subsequent slide. So there's lots of models for partnerships, and some of the ways that I frame these models are the following. There's sort of a social value and intellectual engagement value to partnerships, and we see that with a number of our local efforts around producer-led watershed groups and similar efforts around watershed associations, watershed councils, etc. That's the case at lots of different scales, from local to statewide or even national or international. And a number of these efforts, especially in the case of producer-led watershed groups in Wisconsin, they offer a real opportunity for knowledge sharing and knowledge growth among participants, even across stakeholders, not just among farmers or producers, but from producers to other stakeholders that have an interest and a stake, something to contribute and something to gain from these efforts. And then, of course, these models offer opportunities, as I alluded, for maximizing financial opportunities and expanding financial opportunities. The group on the right you see in this slide, the Dodge County Alliance for Healthy Soil, Healthy Water, they're a multi-stakeholder group that includes lake interests, farmers, professionals, certainly, and government folks working for Extension, DNR, and other agencies, obviously the Dodge County Conservation Department. And that group has garnered significant financial support from non-traditional sources, such as the lake associations and lake districts in Dodge County, to achieve their objectives in ways that they would not likely have if not for this kind of collaboration. So that's a great example of expanding resources to get more done than would otherwise occur through traditional programs and so forth. And then, of course, there's a policy collaboration. In Wisconsin, we traditionally think about collaboration with groups working on things that might be voluntary in nature, but I think it's important to think about collaboration and partnership with our policymakers, be they at the county level, the legislative level, and other levels. And in order to get needed change and needed help for addressing this issue, we're going to need to think about partnership with all policymakers at all levels to make that happen. So just want to briefly touch on a couple of local nitrate, specifically nitrate related partnerships, and they both happen to be examples of producer-led watershed projects. So the first is in Pepin County, Bear Creek Chippewa Farmer Groundwater Group, and then Farmers for Tomorrow in Wapaka and Portage counties. And there are probably others, but these are ones that I know are working specifically on addressing nitrate as a nutrient causing challenges for human and environmental health. And so I mentioned these because many of these producer-led watershed groups, of which now we have, I think, 30 or 35 in Wisconsin, are very welcoming of non-producer stakeholders to be engaged. And that offers really great opportunities for all the reasons I've alluded to before. But they also offer opportunity to specifically focus directly on nitrate reduction. And I talked about a lot of the challenges of that and why it's important. And so I just want to make sure people are aware there's opportunities out there across the state among groups that are specifically addressing nitrate reduction. And then I want to just touch on a gradually growing and functioning nitrate partnership at the state level that involves folks from Extension and elsewhere at UW, several entities at the Department of Natural Resources, Department of Ag, Trade and Consumer Protection, and our Natural Resources Conservation Service colleagues here in Wisconsin. The first thing we're doing in this multi-level partnership is identifying what our mutual needs and priorities are around nitrate. And we're also trying to address gaps in research, gaps in funding, gaps in training for a whole variety of audiences, and then gaps in outreach that we need to address, and by doing so, minimize duplication in those efforts. We're also going to be working on mutually and collaboratively doing training for both our internal and external audiences on the state of science and best practices around nitrate reduction. And then working together to develop nitrate leaching tools to inform on-farm agronomic decision-making. And Chris Kucharik, the subsequent speaker, will talk a little bit about one example of that effort. And then we're working to develop consensus on the science, and then maybe even going beyond that, how to communicate the consensus, and that there is consensus on the science of nitrate contamination and the associated realities of what that means for society to address that in a comprehensive and significant way to make significant changes in water quality. And then finally, in multiple ways, these organizations, both individually and together, are providing support for many of those local partnerships that I talked about in the previous slide. So Kevin, I'm going to stop there and end my remarks and just open the floor for any questions, conversation, and dialogue that might be out there.
Thanks, John. Looking at the Q&A, so there's one question, just a reminder that for anybody that does have questions, please feel free to enter the questions into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to those as they come in. Somebody did have a question regarding the map you showed. With the nitrate concentrations. They were wondering where to go, what the site is to be able to access that information.
Well, I think the simplest way to find this site is to Google Wisconsin Well Water Viewer.
And as John mentioned, it's that site does have nitrate, but it also does have a host of other groundwater contaminants or just naturally occurring groundwater quality concerns that people can access at different scales.
Would you say that's the simplest way to have people find the site, Kevin?
It is, yeah. Wisconsin well water viewer into any search engine would basically get you there. Another question that just came in is how do we track what is happening with the state partnership? If somebody wanted to know what's going on,
Mhm.
maybe with kind of the things that UW is doing, but also maybe more broadly with regard to some of those farmer-led watershed groups, is there a way
Yeah.
to track what's going on with those partnerships?
Yeah, great question. I would say with respect to what UW is doing, folks can contact me directly. Obviously, Kevin is a part of our internal collaboration, our nitrate working group. Actually, Chris Kacharik is as well. But I would say I'm happy to be and partly responsible for being a liaison or a portal to that group internally and to our four organization partnership. So in terms of a way to access what's going on, I really encourage people to reach out directly to me or to anybody in those entities. In terms of tracking producer-led watershed groups, I think the best way to ask or even challenge that question is to contact those groups directly. Farmers in those groups recognize that they are responsible for, tracking results of their work. And frankly, the general public in Wisconsin has an interest in that, having funded a lot of the work of those groups. And at the same time, it is very difficult to track in short-term timeframes the direct results on specifically, we're talking about nitrates today, on water quality as a result of some of those practices. But I think really engaging with those groups and asking the questions, what are the metrics folks are using to over time determine impact from the efforts they're taking, are very legitimate questions.
Another, a couple questions on the topic of, more specifics about what some of the local partnerships are doing with regard to nitrate in groundwater,
Yeah. Yep.
building on that too. Yeah, I mean, start there and then there's a kind of a
Sure.
follow-up question.
Yes. Well, like most of the in the case of the producer-led watershed groups, most of the groups are engaged in they're in their infancy in essence as organizations, and so they're engaged in mutual learning and a growth in learning about management practices that impact water quality, be it surface water or groundwater. So they're doing an awful lot of education among their members, and in many cases outside their membership, to the general public and interested audiences about management changes that result in reductions in nutrients, both to surface water and groundwater. So their experimentation with cover crops and no-till and nitrogen management practices in an attempt to reduce impact on water quality from farm practices. In some cases, they're changing specific crops, they're altering crop mixes, they're altering crop rotations, the types of tillage being used, and a variety of other things that fit into existing farm management systems to try and minimize and reduce the impact on water quality, both surface water and groundwater. So they're really the specific efforts are around water quality. How that looks on an individual farm or an individual region in Wisconsin varies a lot based on local conditions, soil types, even climate conditions, and so forth. So there's a number of things producers can do to reduce those impacts, and they're really tailored to their farm system and the local conditions in which they're farming.
So all those, probably a lot of people are listening and thinking those all sound like great things to do. The natural follow-up question to that is how do these groups or these entities find the funding to either
Mhm.
grow these partnerships or maybe implement practices that they can kind of experiment with or try out?
Yes. Well, I think I'm a believer that the funding opportunities are nearly endless if people think creatively. Um, and I mentioned specifically the Dodge County group because they significantly expanded their funding available by engaging directly with lake. They have 3 lake associations and lake districts in Dodge County, and they are directly engaged through the Dodge County Alliance with those organizations. And by doing so, they've dramatically expanded funding available for cover crops and no-till and other practices to reduce runoff and increase infiltration and so forth in those areas in Dodge County. I think that's an example of how creatively and how working collaboratively can significantly expand funding. Now that is maybe perceived as a two-edged sword by some producers because it could then lead to more scrutiny. But I think the power of that relationship between those organizations is really strong, and it's created opportunities that I don't think those organizations would have anticipated when they initiated this project and this effort in Dodge County. So, there's all kinds of traditional sources, lots and lots of traditional sources for most, if not all, of these management practices, Kevin, that offer cost sharing from NRCS to county conservation departments and Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. So there are many of these practices that address multiple conservation benefits. The best place to start to find those opportunities if you're a landowner is your county conservation department.
There's maybe one last question before we wrap up here. We're approaching the end of the time, but question about renewable energy projects, and that's becoming more popular, I think, as a way to maybe maintain some income while still being able to maintain the landscape
Yeah,
for agricultural activity. What
yeah.
with regard to energy projects, what's the impact of those on nitrate reduction?
Wow, that is a great question. So the bottom portion of that slide I showed that had relative reductions in nitrate from different management practices or land use changes. And if you think about maybe a large scale or even a modest scale energy project, such as a solar project, yes, people have anxiety over the aesthetics of some of those things, such as wind farms and so forth. But conversion of highly sensitive land or land that's highly vulnerable to leaching in areas of the state, to me, are prime areas where those sorts of projects should be considered, where we have not just the energy reduction or renewable energy production benefits, but also the potential for reduction in nitrate leaching or other environmental impacts. So I think the two, again, thinking creatively and thinking about this in a collaborative way can lead to multiple benefits beyond the primary intended benefits. So that's a great question. Maybe a great way to wrap it up, Kevin.
Thanks, John. And that'll have to conclude John's talk here as we move on to the next speaker.